Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sarah Audsley, and I am the Writing Across Media Facilitator, which means I manage the writing program here at Vermont Studio Center. We are located in northern Vermont in the town of Johnson, and we are a year-round international residency program for visual artists and writers. This time of year, our campus is bisected by the Gihon River, and all the leaves are changing. So we have fall foliage seasons happening right now, which is my favorite time of year. That brings me to our land acknowledgement. I want to take a moment to recognize that we operate on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange for thousands of years and is the traditional home of the Abenaki people. We honor, recognize, and respect these peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and waters on which we gather. Tonight, thank you for joining us for our Writer to Writer reading, which is a conversation on craft and featured reading series, which pairs writers together to read from their work and to discuss aspects of being a working writer. This has been one of my favorite reading series to curate for virtual VSC, and it is my pleasure to introduce both readers tonight. I will introduce both of them. They will both read, and then we'll switch to conversation and questions after their short readings. Our first reader tonight is Emilio Carrero, who is a recent postdoctoral fellow in English from the University of Arizona. His work has been published in Terrain.org, Essay Daily, Guernica, and is forthcoming in Kenyon Review Online. He has received scholarships from the Aspen Institute, the Sewanee Writers Conference, and the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. He is a former fellow for the Field Studies in Writing program at the University of Arizona and the former editor-in-chief of Sonora Review. He is currently working on a memoir. Thank you so much for being here, Emilio. Our second reader tonight is Francisco Cantú, who is a writer, translator, and the author of The Line Becomes a River, winner of the 2018 Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in nonfiction. A former Fulbright Fellow, he has been the recipient of a Pushcart Prize, a Whiting Award, and an Art for Justice Fellowship. His writing and translations have been featured in The New Yorker, Best American Essays, Harper's, and VQR, as well as on This American Life. A lifelong resident of the Southwest, he now lives in Tucson and coordinates the Field Studies in Writing program at the University of Arizona, a residency that fosters work at the intersection of border justice and environmental issues. Thank you so much for being here, Francisco. It's such a pleasure to have you both here with us this evening. And this reading series pairs two writers together, and oftentimes they both know each other and are dear friends. And this is the case here. I know both of these writers have known each other for a long time. So I'm really excited to hear both of them read and to hear their conversation. And you can drop your questions into the chat afterwards or unmute and ask your questions directly. Without further ado, I will turn it over to our first reader, Emilio.
Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it. Yes, I'm just going to read a piece from an essay that I've been working on. It's a photo essay, so I'll actually share my screen and have just a couple of photos to accompany each of the sections that I'm reading. So let's see. All right, and the working title for this is Mi Abuelo's Solitude. I was 3 years old when I met a dying Puerto Rican creature. We were standing in the living room of my childhood home. It stood at the threshold of the room, its eyes bloodshot, scanning its surroundings, its hair matted and dust-colored, weeding out into different directions. Its cheekbones and jaw flared, protruding from its hollow face with each breath. By then, the creature that stood in front of me was less my grandfather, my mother's father, Abuelo, as us kids called him, and more of a strange animal, dying in a room that I wasn't allowed to go inside of. I had been jumping around all afternoon in my underwear, half naked and sweating, anything to cool down from the heat that breathed over our house like a panting mouth. I had been banging into furniture and walls, toying with my action figures, shouting to everyone and no one, playing as kids do. I must have awakened it. It staggered off of its hospice bed and into the living room. It froze, I froze. I eyed it like the southern toads and garter snakes and palmetto bugs that I chased around my swampy backyard. I saw how brittle-boned it was, at the half-button hospital gown draped over it, at its bare brown feet unsteadily propping up its sickly wrinkled frame. I noticed a black leather belt was trembling in its hand. Nimble and curious, I didn't know whether to be afraid. I simply stood in front of it, mouth open, eyes unblinking. I could hear my feet, caked black, shifting under the dirtied floors. I didn't know how or why it was dying, but I had a childish intuition that something was wrong. It was trying to talk to me, but the words collapsed into puff noises each time. They left its mouth. It didn't move so much as lurch, as if its limbs were a burden, uncooperative bones and muscles holding back its fierce eyes and rapidly moving mouth. A living room surrounded us, the plastic-wrapped sofa too hot and too sticky for me to sleep on, the sharp coffee table I banged my scabby legs on, the 80s-style television set that I seemingly kissed with my eyes most days. And yet, by the look of this creature's eyes, everything around us was a kind of domestic wilderness that I had stumbled into. But this had been its home for years, the same home it had posed outside of for a photograph years earlier, before I was born. It stood alongside its family, legs straight, chest puffed, beer in hand. How much of this home it now remembered was unclear. At 3 years old, all I knew was that its shriveled, angry face and the black leather belt trembling in its hand augured some act of violence for me. Whatever it was that stood in front of me, it meant me harm. It continued to look around, scanning the room, and as it did, I remember saying its name aloud for the first time, as if to speak its name meant that it was he for the first time in my little life, a summoning in my boyish mind. Abuelo? Cállate, he said, and I jumped. ¿Quieres otro? He weakly shook his belt at me. Abuelo's first words to me were rough and hoarse-sounding, though they seemed to sap away most of his energy. And although I knew a man who was my grandfather lived in a bedroom inside my home, I didn't know him. He had gotten sick a year after I was born. His deterioration started with a car accident. A driver T-boned my mother and him at an intersection while I sat in the back seat. Unharmed, according to the firemen and EMTs that found me. At the hospital, the doctors discovered his liver was failing. A lifetime of drinking himself to sleep had come to fruition. Finally, they realized cancer had spread into his prostate, leaving him dying in a small bedroom in a suburban home in Florida. It was the same home that he had bought using his winnings from underground gambling in Spanish Harlem. A set of weekly numbers he played with a bookie eventually hit after many years. He won $40,000, and he used those winnings to move him and his wife, my grandmother, down to Florida. Illegally and suddenly, a fitting way for my poor immigrant parents to retire. As I stood before him now, that home, which had now become my childhood home, was falling into disrepair and bankruptcy. A year after I was born, my mother had moved us to Florida to take care of him. His medical bills, our overdue mortgage, my clinically depressed single mother, our home reflected our lives, an unwelcome outgrowth, pussing from the white American skin of suburbia. Our home was infested with roaches and frogs and unpaid bills and poor Puerto Ricans, a plot of land and walls and roof overrun by creatures, crumbling under the pressures of a family's crushing debts. Behind Abuelo, I could see the front door. It was afternoon because the sunlight always shined in from the front windows. No one else was around. He was laboring to stand upright, to gather himself and puff out his chest like in the photos I still have of him. He had been a tall man, the only one in my family to stand easily north of 6 feet. And this, along with his sharp eyes and bull chest, made him an intimidating presence. Though weakened and dying, I was feeling his presence for the first time. I was feeling that intimidation. Though as a boy, I knew this presence less as the slow, thickening air of impending violence that I would come to know my whole life, and more as the unfamiliar fear of being unable to move the longer I stood in front of him. I could feel my small body locking up, paralyzed by my creaturely grandfather looming in front of me. So I ran for the front door. He shouted when I did. Too weak to grab me, he whipped his belt at me, lashing my back as I ran past him. The belt cracked against my skin, and I felt a welt forming as his shouting echoed behind me. A tear formed right in my eye, blurring my sight. But I didn't stop. I shot out the front door. I dashed down the sidewalk, my brown, half-naked self running through my white suburban neighborhood, where US flags and Confederate flags hung indiscriminately in the driveways, where every lawn but ours was pristine and evergreen. I kept pumping my dirtied, sunbaked limbs forward, step after step, fueled by a kiddish certainty of what marked the proper distance for safety, oblivious to the impossibility of my dying grandfather chasing me, and clueless as to what or whom I was truly running away from. Years later, I would realize that I was unrecognizable to Abuelo too. He had asked me, ¿Quieres otro? Do you want another one, another beating? Maybe he had thought I was his son, my uncle, who he used to beat mercilessly into the carpet floor as a boy, while my mother listened from behind her bedroom door. Or maybe he thought that I was him, and that he was his father, my great-grandfather, who used to beat him mercilessly against the tin walls of their ramshackle home in Puerto Rico. Whoever we were supposed to be in that moment, Abuelo and I first met each other from across different times. Nothing, it seems now, could be more fitting than for us to have met like this, for my Puerto Rican grandfather to have been standing and dying in a time different than that of his American grandson, living and running. And yet, whether he realized it or not, I came to know that whipping sound and my blinding tears as the first time I ever brushed up against my family's past. It's as if my grandfather felt the desperate dying need to reach out from whatever memory he was mired inside of and whiplash my skin with my family's violent history. A history so much more than merely a stinging leather crack done to cower me into obedience, and rather was his way of ensuring, as best he could, that I never forgot our shared ancestral curse, that our bodies would always be a reminder of the island that no one wanted to remember. The history of my family is found in the few remaining photos of Abuelo, my mother's father. I had taken the photos with me when I moved out west for graduate school, desperate to get as far away as I could from my family. I didn't remember taking these photos. I had packed very little before leaving, my unknowing way of continuing my family's age-old tradition of forgetting. And yet the photos were there in my suitcase, as if I had packed them in a fugue state. Still, I didn't look at them, and I didn't throw them away. I tucked them away into a closet. Growing up, the only times I ever got close to the photos of Abuelo was late at night. Sometimes I'd stumble into my mother's bedroom and see family photos scattered across the ground while she sat in the middle of them, cross-legged, staring at them with half wonder, half worry, as if they had spilled out of her ears, and she was now both shocked and intrigued by the mess she had made. As if she were sitting amidst ruins and seeds, the rubble and garden of our family's collective silence. Watching her, there was always something cosmically frightening about this tableau of her surrounded by these photos, as if my mother, by virtue of holding the photos in her hands, was, at the same time, holding the history of my family, a secretive summoning of the past that I could see playing out across her face. Susan Sontag writes the photographs turn the world into a series of unrelated, freestanding particles, both of past and present. The camera, she writes, makes reality atomic, manageable, and opaque. This seems right to me, and so I want to say that as a boy, watching my mother with these photos, I was watching her hold the very atoms of my family's reality, our past and present, that she was sifting through a universe that had been built by these photos and was being delicately arranged by her memories. Whatever cosmic happening that was surrounding her, I knew not to disturb my mother in these moments. I knew that I needed to hide behind a corner or watch her through a crack in the door, which I always did. I crouched behind whatever I could in those late night hours, that the only sounds my hushed breaths and the photos shuffling across the ground, the humming of a universe that seemed so powerful, it terrified me. Nothing was scarier for me than the seeming power of these photographs, how the particles of a past came together to form atoms of my family's lives. They were the bricks of a ruin I couldn't quite name yet, and so they terrified me. not because they were mysterious or unknowable, but because I had a creeping suspicion that I knew exactly what they were. My suspicions were clued to me by the weeping, self-destructive men in my family that I watched from a distance and the silent, survivalist women that raised me. I was terrified of knowing what I already felt as a member of my family: violence, heartache, and inevitable solitude. When I first moved to Tucson, the photos I had brought with me only came out when I was drunkenly alone. They seemed to be the only things capable of stopping me from drinking until I vomited, and yet it was only when I was drunk that I had the courage to face my abuelo. More than 20 years had passed since I looked abuelo in the eyes. Sober, I had avoided the memory of him like the rest of my family. Drunk, I hungered for him more than anyone alive in my family. I dragged out the photos only when the mood and situation were inevitably right. When the nights hit that special desert hour in which the city quiets long enough to hear the coyotes howling and the late night trains roaring in the distance. It was the time of night when I had been drinking long enough for my living room floor to be lined with beer bottles and nips, my little glass and plastic decorations that I delicately arranged atop the flattened cardboard boxes that I used for furniture. It was the time of night when the greasy fast food had been eaten and its crumbled bags thrown into corners, when the stacks of books had been skimmed through and put against walls, when the idea of killing myself had been tossed around for an hour like a baseball, walk headfirst into an oncoming train, or maybe swiftly and easily by a firearm in this constitutional carry state. My casita and I properly primed for my Puerto Rican remembering. Then and only then did I bring out these photos. To do all of this felt like a ritual, a taxing way of summoning the dead. If at the time I was surprised by this drunken ritual, then now I realized how necessary it all was. Suicidal and chronically drunk, there was no way for me to avoid abuelo. Hundreds of miles away from my family, I withdrew from them and drew closer to the man who had been dead for most of my life. Part of this, I realized, was a desire to see a face that affirmed my self-harm, to see the photos of him holding the beer cans or styrofoam cups of liquor that would eventually kill him, and to feel not so much normal as familial. If my grandfather had drunk himself to death, lost all his money, abandoned his family, then I was nothing special. I was not an outlier. I was my grandfather's inheritor. I felt right inheriting these things from him. The family prophecy my mother had been telling me my whole life, the story she had told me in which a psychic predicted a life of poverty and heartache and death, seemed to describe my abuelo also, or the little I knew about him. And my mother was the one responsible for delivering this story, this prophecy to me as a boy, when I saw my grandfather as the origin of it. I had spent my whole life trying to outrun my family's prophecy without ever stopping to question it. It had been already ingrained into my life, an age-old horizon to my consciousness that had always appeared as true. I simply took it as a given fact that I had inherited my grandfather's cursed life. And it was this curse that seemed to be chasing my family and me since I was born, from evicted home to evicted home, from fistfights to knife fights, from Puerto Rico to the US. But only the living can be outrun. There is no escaping the dead. Abuelo lurked at the edges of my everyday life. There was no avoiding him because there was no avoiding myself. My drunken rituals, my summoning of a man I barely knew, was my way of seeking the origin story of our cursed lives. For both of us, self-harm was our common language, the bodily syntax we both followed, and as such was the only way, however deadly, for me to begin sifting through the cursed memories of his life that he had left for me and the rest of my family. Drunk, I wanted to be able to hold the images of my grandfather in my hands and stare him down, as if to do so was to stare down my family's prophecy. Destiny was what I wanted to feel in my hands in order to come to terms with what I believed was my family's inevitability. In this sense, there was no avoiding abuelo. He had been waiting for me my entire life. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Emilio. Just want to take a moment here to let that sit. I'm really excited for your memoir, and thank you for sharing this portion of your larger project. I'm really grateful to hear you, and thanks for also sharing those images. Francisco, the floor is now yours. Thank you for being here. And I'm looking forward to hearing your reading as well.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And Emilio, thanks for such a beautiful reading. Emilio and I have known each other for a really long time, but we've never read together like this. And I'm also going to be reading about my family. So it was so beautiful to hear about yours, about your family story. So thanks to everybody who's here on this Wednesday night. Thanks to Vermont Studio Center for putting this together and giving Emilio and I a chance to sort of deepen our literary dialogue. I'm also going to read from a larger project that I'm working on. I've been visiting a lot of national parks this year and writing more generally a lot about landscape and thinking about how my family story is connected to landscape. And so I'll just kind of, this is sort of just from the middle of a much larger essay, but hopefully it holds together. I don't have a title for this, but I'm just going to jump in. When I was a child, my mother worked as a park ranger in the Guadalupe Mountains National Park in West Texas, one of the least visited parks in the United States. Her duties were not just to help protect and preserve the natural beauty of parklands, but more specifically to interpret the stories of these places for visitors by describing the interconnectedness of the flora, the fauna, and the human inhabitants that have mingled there throughout history. Storytelling wasn't just something my mother did for work. She told stories at home too, at a time when my mind was just beginning to grasp and file away memories. Living in the Guadalupes, we had to drive over an hour and a half to reach the nearest grocery store in El Paso, Texas, or Carlsbad, New Mexico. And on our weekly trips to the city, the highway across the desert was so empty that we often saw more jackrabbits than passing cars. I loved my mother's stories so much back then that during these long drives, I would beg for her to tell me tales to pass the time, one after another. These requests would often exhaust her, and it wasn't long before she implemented a new rule, refusing to tell me a new story until I told her one in return. As a 4-year-old, I would insist that I didn't know any stories, but my mother would simply point toward the horizon and ask me to describe what I saw. I quickly learned to name the passing features. I see peaks and clouds, I told her, rocks and sand, birds and rabbits. Well, my mother would say, make a story about them. Soon, storytelling became an easy exchange between my mother and I, one I came to understand as profoundly rooted in one's surroundings. This is also how, ever since I can remember, I was made to look to the landscape for inspiration and for guidance, a place where I could connect with a deeper sense of self. In those early days, I came to perceive the windswept mountains and Permian canyons of the Guadalupes as altogether free of confusion or darkness, and I found it impossible to imagine, even for a moment, that such a place might ever be made to hold anything other than sheer beauty. I've recently been reflecting on how my mother developed her proclivity for storytelling, and I've begun to realize that for her, stories about place and landscape in many ways superseded the family stories that often first shape how we see ourselves and our place in the world. Throughout the entirety of my childhood, for example, I cannot remember ever discussing with her the fact that my grandfather was an immigrant, that his consciousness had been forged in another language, another country. I don't remember anyone ever telling me that he was Mexican, or that I, in some small but meaningful way, was too. I now realize that my mother barely understood this herself. Growing up, she possessed a single photograph of her father, and retained only the haziest memory of him holding her as an infant. Her parents' early separation meant that she was raised by a single mother far away from him, not knowing the sound of his voice, the touch of his hands, or the stories or places that shaped him. Perhaps it was partially due to the absence of a father figure from her interior life that my mother often turned outward to construct an idea of herself, looking most often to the outdoor spaces that surrounded her to find meaning. In her teenage years, this meant the Arizona desert, replete with its dizzying array of earth-toned creatures, fantastical plant life, and its bewildering topography of deep canyons and rolling bajadas, hidden waters and dry washes, jagged mountaintops and unending ranges of volcanic stone. This terrain was also one steeped in myth, a superimposed lore of discovery and solace that for my mother would have been far more accessible than her own family story. In this way, the landscape must have offered her an element of certainty, or at least the kind of mystery that could be understood and investigated, interpreted and described. The stories my mother passed on to me did not deal with the exploits or misadventures of relatives and ancestors. Like her, I grew up without brothers and sisters, without aunts and uncles, without a cloud of cousins swirling around me, trafficking in family gossip. Instead, my mother passed on to me songs and folk tales, stories of animals and forces of nature sprung to life. This, in turn, shaped how I came to understand myself and the world around me. Not by discerning family lineage and lore, but by learning the names of trees and rivers, the cycles of seasons and storms, the sounds and signs of creatures moving just outside our doors, teeming always around us. After she became an interpretive ranger, my mother, a storyteller by nature, also became a storyteller by trade. As she moved across the country from one park to another, her day-to-day job was to make comprehensible to visitors the history and ecology of some of the most iconic places on Earth: the Great Smoky Mountains, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, Muir Woods, crafting narratives that would help anchor the visitor's sense of awe in science and cultural record. In a sense, this also meant that my mother was conscripted into the work of national myth-making, sometimes recounting state-crafted narratives time and again that, for all their romantic evocation, simplified and obscured violence long ago written into the American landscape. The wilderness that my mother and I held dear, the places that fed our soul and gave us meaning, were not only sites of preservation, but of erasure as well, sites where the original inhabitants had been snuffed out and wilderness had been reformed, in part, as it existed in the mind of a colonizing populace, places presented in the early days of the National Park Service as sites of, quote, primeval solitude, never before trodden by human footsteps. I think it bears mentioning that the idea of national parks in America was, from the very beginning, formed in relationship to bloodshed. When President Lincoln first signed the Yosemite land grant in 1864, the country was still deep in the throes of the Civil War, which still officially stands as the bloodiest conflict ever waged in our history. Photographs of Yosemite's stunning landmarks had already begun to proliferate across America, and the images represented the kind of grandeur that Lincoln and others hoped could offer a kind of peace and solace that might help serve to unify a nation and mend a bloodied national psyche. After the establishment of the preserve, America's most celebrated landscape architect and the designer of New York's Central Park, Frederick Law Olmsted, was named as one of the first overseers of the newly created park. Olmsted soon became one of the foremost advocates for a nationwide system of parks, and helped to define the philosophical underpinnings for administering public lands across the country. Setting aside and preserving wild spaces, he thought, could provide an antidote to the profound violence that had riven the nation, offering a place to calm one's spirit. Above all else, Olmsted argued, parks were a place to gain tranquility and rest to the mind. Olmsted's thinking about public lands continued to define American discourse and policy on these matters well into the next century. Wallace Stegner, America's Dean of Western Writers, would write nearly 50 years after the establishment of America's national parks that the country's protected lands had come to form a geography of hope. Despite the indigenous genocide and removal that underlies so much federal land ownership, the notion of hope is still central to the predominant cultural discourse about the American outdoors. For my mother, as for so many others, I believe that the stories told about America's most cherished places, what Terry Tempest Williams calls the closest thing we have to sacred land, helped anchor her in the idea of a wild space that could fill a lacuna within, one rooted, in her case, in growing up without a fully told family story. The absence of this story is one that I inherited too, and as I have grown older, I've often sought to uncover the stories of my grandfather's family. Their most often recounted pieces of family lore seem to have been rendered like the mythology of American wilderness, only in the broadest of strokes. I have long heard, for example, that as a child, my grandfather and his siblings fled their home by taking a train in the dead of night across a countryside ravaged by the Mexican Revolution. As the sun rose and they neared the US border, they watched in the dawn light as silhouettes emerged of bodies hanging from trees. But once they arrived here as refugees, the story they most repeated was one that placed them alongside long dead kings and conquerors. The Cantús, various family members insisted, were descended from Spanish royalty and could trace our line directly to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, the monarchs who oversaw the final bloody act of the Reconquista and sponsored the first voyage of Columbus, two events that have torn at the fabric of history ever since. My ancestors clung to this story, this supposed lineage buried more than 4 centuries behind them on a continent none of them had ever known, far more than they ever seemed to embrace their identity as Mexican immigrants, as if being tied to that place somehow threatened them with an otherness that was to be rejected swiftly and out of hand. After settling in San Diego, and with the benefit of their light skin, my immigrant family was quickly subsumed by new American lives. I have collected several photographs from these early years in California. Images of my great-grandfather working at the newsstand where he sold imported Mexican magazines and Spanish-language newspapers. Pictures of my grandfather at work as a delivery boy. Pictures of his sisters posing in flapper dresses and his brothers suited up for local dances in tuxedos and bow ties. And later, pictures of them in uniform as soldiers being trained for war. There are also pictures from family trips up and down the length of California. Pictures of my grandfather standing beside windswept beaches and giant redwoods, and even posing in front of the unmistakable granite domes of Yosemite. These were places, I am sure, where he must have felt undoubtedly American. Immigrant identity is frequently understood as something shaped by cycles of loss and reclamation, determined most often by outside forces, the violence of governments and poverty, the upheaval of social rupture and cultural change. But when stories and traditions are left behind, new myths soon rise up to take their place, presaging the internal struggle that often lies ahead. The newcomer, their children, their children's children, each is progressively subsumed into the unwavering machinations of assimilation, venturing closer and closer to an identity always represented as more desirable than their own. I have come to suspect that my Mexican ancestors all learned to cling most forcefully to the fantasy placing them alongside long dead kings and conquerors during those early, most formative years in the United States, when the value of claiming whiteness would have become even more apparent than it had been in their homeland. In America, they would have quickly understood that Mexican meant brown, while Spanish carried a possible association with a continent always imagined to be superior. In this way, they also learned to erase themselves, or more precisely, to erase the place they came from, expunging Mexico from their outward selves in ways both simple and profound. Such acts of reinvention are also a kind of disappearance, the slow and quiet replacement of one story with another, more powerful one. These inescapable narratives, which continue to estrange so many of us from ourselves, are fearsome, not just for how they become ingrained into a national psyche, but for the way they become so deeply woven into our own confused hearts, embedding themselves into the people and places that surround us, taking up residence even in the physical terrain that surrounds us, in the very soil we walk on. What I have now begun to recognize is that there is surely a connection between the mythology of immigrant assimilation and the stories we tell about American wilderness. When we obscure or deny the tangled roots that underlie any history, we introduce a void into the story, be it the story of a family, the places we hold dear, or the nation we call home. A void that festers the longer it is ignored, that is passed on from one generation to the next until it is finally spoken aloud, named like the passing features in the landscape, like an animal stirring outside our door. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. Emilio, come on back. Maybe let's start here. Where are you both in your individual projects? I'm wondering how both of you think of the word either imagination or speculation in your work.
Those are great questions, and I also love thinking about those sort of resonances in the two readings that we chose today. Yeah, great question about imagination or speculation, because it's something that I think within the last year, like this year, I've begun to think about a lot more. So much of my family history, or just like the way that they saw the world, or the way they perceived themselves, or like the things that they loved and missed about the place where they came from, it's like totally unknown to me, and there's like very few people who are alive who have any memory of hearing any of them reflect about this. And I have an aunt, my mom, for all the reasons I laid out in the essay, didn't really have access to a lot of those stories. And so I think for a long time it just felt like is something that I could never have access to, or that just couldn't be known, period. And I think that felt like just like a huge dead end, or like a big brick wall. Some of the traveling that I've done in the last few years, just in kind of big broad ways that I didn't know at the time are connected to this project. Or I went back to the city where my family left during the Mexican Revolution, and it's just like it was very strange to be there without having any. I had some photographs and like street names, and that was kind of it. And I had the opportunity to talk with a writer I really admire, to interview her earlier this year. Her name is Christina Rivera Garza. She's a Mexican writer. And I sort of asked her about this question because one thing I love about her work, and specifically like a project that she's engaged with now, is this sort of like what's the right word, like a anthropology of like family objects that she has inherited, and like tracing what cities they were made in and like how they might have come into the hands of her family and what they were used for by her family and all of these things that just feel so anchored and like tangible. And I remember asking her, about just like how, what like, or I think I remember like lamenting out loud to her, like not having access to those kinds of stories. And what she told me really surprised me, where she said, a lot of people have this idea that like as children, we're tucked in for bed by our grandparents and they're like telling us the stories of their lives or something. And she said, it's almost never like that. And she told me, which I was surprised to hear, that like so much of the work that she has done, she's a fiction writer and a poet. I don't think of myself as somebody who writes in either of those genres, but I think like maybe having access to that, it was easier for her to give herself access to the imagination and to the speculative. And so she says like so much of what she's reconstructed about her family is, informed imagination, informed speculation. And I think that really like opened a door for me, or just like kind of made it feel like that brick wall maybe, was like a barbed wire fence that you could like find a way under or something like that. So I guess I'll stop there. I've already said a lot.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, go ahead, Emilio. It sounds exciting to me because I know that you're nonfiction, like research based, like your first book, like also, and like, but the electricity happens between the fact and the speculation or the imagination, and the writing can fill in the gaps in between, and that's the job of the writer in some ways, in the pieces that you presented this evening. But Emilio, would you like to do you have any thoughts on how you approach the imagination or speculation in your process?
Yeah, I mean, listening to Paco, I think kind of helped me maybe articulate my thoughts. Maybe that's why I asked him to go first. I think, well, I guess maybe the way I think about it is maybe in like a weirdly kind of like inverse way to maybe the way Paco was thinking about it. And I mean, I think we're both, at least what you write today, and I think what I'm working on, we're both looking at mythologies and the stories that they get told about, not just our families, but, the communities we're a part of. And I guess I began to realize that that a lot of these mythologies are inherently limiting or constricting, right, for obvious reasons, right? The stories we tell about immigrants or people of color. And so I guess for me, I began to really start to like push up against like what lies outside of the mythology, and like what can the mythology not fully capture. And so that's part of my obsession with my grandfather, is that so much of the kind of cultural stories that my family internalized, and Paco was talking about that of his family, he kind of never really fully internalized them, and in a lot of ways he was kind of like this outlier. And so I think that's part of my obsession, is that in a lot of ways he kind of stands outside of a lot of the kind of cultural American mythologies that my family and I that we kind of internalize. And I think Paco said like inescapable narratives, right? I think that so yeah, for me, like looking outside of the mythologies is where the imagination has like that real energy, which I think you just said, Sarah, like there's that electricity right outside like facts, or like the set of facts we've been given, which aren't necessarily the only facts. Yeah.
I think, Emilio, something that I was also thinking of while you were talking is like part of that mythology in the piece that you read also just has to do with like the figure of the grandfather, right? Like there's these national mythologies that we inherit, and then there's like, I think, cultural mythologies that are specific to the stories told in different cultures. but then there's also just like the mythology of like the parent or like the grandparent. And I think, yeah, that's just like, it's something even harder to articulate or to name, just the power that someone has simply by being an ancestor. And like, yeah, I don't know quite how, I mean, I've been thinking so much about like how the mythology of wilderness connects to just like the, you know, mythologies of immigrant histories or like erased histories. And that's just like a whole nother wormhole that can be like explored and mined. Um, yeah, like living myths in our lives. To be like, that's the sense that I had of your grandfather.
Mm. Yeah, no, when I was listening to you, yeah, I remember I wrote this down because I was wondering, because it seemed like when you were reading, there was like this kind of really strong ambivalence about these stories that, you know, that your mom has kind of were a part of, you know, her career and what she did. And I guess, yeah, that's what I was wondering is like, what's the appeal for you about looking at these narratives? Because like you said, they are inescapable, right? But at the same time, there's and it seemed like you're talking about that with the writer, there's like this like thing you don't have access to that you're chasing after, but it's kind of sometimes hard to pin down. So I guess, yeah, when you're chasing this down, like, is there a carrot that you kind of have in front of you that you're really chasing down uh that's really trying to get at the heart of you know, your family stories and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think the way that I've been thinking about this project is like very like place based or site based, like imagining or looking at like different sites that have importance in like a family history or mythology, and at the same time, either, you know, in separate essays or in the same essay, like sites that represent like some other sort of historical mythology, or sites that have been, you know, like deeply mythologized. Um, but yeah, I, you know, it's still, I'm still very much in this like exploration phase of, you know, writing things that seem like wildly different from one another. And then like, you know, a lot of times readings are great for this because you kind of, you're like, okay, I've got 15 minutes, like how many words is that, like what, you know, like part of this and part of this seem connected, I haven't put them together before. And so that has been like a big learning, or just like a big opportunity. I mean, I get like probably most of us on this call are writers, and that's, you know, like one of the exciting things that writing offers us. But yeah, I just like, I feel like I would be nowhere without it, and that sounds weird. Like when I have conversations with my mother, like I think that, you know, even though, you know, she is sort of an elder now and, you know, has more time and has began to sort of think about and investigate like family history and lineage and genealogy and all of this stuff, like I think like it all still feels very far away for her, or like remote, like it's like the dusty history book.
Yeah.
And for me that is also true, but I think writing makes it different because like you have to put your hands on it, and you have to be like, if I'm gonna try to write something about it, like I have to make words you know, that like make sense. And so it like, it forces you to engage with the material in a different way, and I feel really grateful for that element of like the craft of writing, as hard as it is, or as frustrating as it can be.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I want to invite anyone who has like a burning question. Oh, okay, there's one. So Darcy says, I am wondering what you both mean by mythology, as you keep mentioning myths. Well, it sounds more like you're trying to communicate deep seeds or traumatic events and the concept of gender in your family histories. Why do you call this mythology instead of memories? which would ultimately empower you as readers and writers. And yeah, I think that that's an interesting question. I think memory, well, sorry, I don't want to answer this question. It's posed for both of you. But
No,
yeah,
please, go for it.
so like, you know, as a writer, a person who cares about words and semantics and the meanings behind them, we have, you know, memory, mythology, storytelling. And would you like to explain, each of you individually, which, you know, why you might gravitate towards talking about mythology versus, you know, memory? If I'm interpreting Darcy's question correctly.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that I think memory is a part of mythology, but I think that I find mythology much more of an encompassing term, which is to say that it is storytelling that's situated in a community. And so, so while I may have a memory of, I don't know, racism that I experienced as a kid, it doesn't fully get at the broader story that kind of encompasses that experience or that memory, which is to say that like the stories that the South told itself after Reconstruction and stuff like that. So that's what I mean by mythology, is the kind of larger overarching story. And then of course my memories kind of fit within that umbrella.
Yeah, I think maybe when I start to gravitate towards the term mythology is, you know, as Emilio sort of said at the beginning of his answer, you know, like when memories become shared across like a community or like multiple generations or something like that. But also for me, what seems to be an important part of it is like when memory, when a story begins to diverge from, you know, the actuality of what happened, and when when it is told so many times that that it feels like history. So I think maybe like mythology. I haven't really thought about this. I'm kind of just talking off the top of my head. But you know, like when memory, when a collective memory starts to feel like history, but is actually a story. And I think that it is a really interesting question, like when family mythology, when a family memory becomes something else like mythology. And that's something I haven't quite, you know, like that sort of line is a blurry one, and I haven't totally traced out like where and when that has happened in my own life. But I do think it's an interesting point that like maybe it could be more empowering to think of certain things as memories, which I think implies maybe like an intimacy, you know, which you know, it could be empowering as Darcy mentioned in their question.
Yeah, I'm really yeah, this is a lot. This is a lot to think about too, because I feel like the mythologies that we have in our own lives are also because some things patterns can be seen in the stories that we tell, both like in our lives and like in our ancestral lineages, and it's like feels like a more overarching, like you can see patterns and you can see how things might repeat or be a trope, you know, or you know, anyway. One more question. James was wondering, so Darcy says they do sound like intimate and personal stories. Yeah. James has a question. How do you balance in-scene stuff with memories or more cerebral parts in your writing?
Gosh, I love for the things to sort of blend together, like for memory and research to sort of like flow out from something else. And I think maybe that, you know, at least with this project, so much of it is anchored in like traveling through different landscapes, and and I like the sort of equality of letting like a memory could bubble up from this landscape, like a personal history could bubble up from this landscape, or like a more cerebral, like research-based historical sort of scene reconstruction, as opposed to like memory reconstruction, where you're sort of imagining history through the landscape that you're traveling through, that it might have taken place in. So balancing, I guess, the stuff seems I don't know if it seems natural, but it seems like a more honest way of like looking at a landscape, and that's definitely like one of the questions that like seems really important to me with this project, is like, what are more honest, like truthful ways of seeing, traveling through and thinking about landscape.
Emilio, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, I think I'm still trying to fully understand it. So I guess the way I'm understanding the question is like what's the ratio? Is that maybe that's and if that's the question, then I guess okay, yeah, James said yeah. Okay, so how do you balance the ratio? I don't know if there's a kind of sweet spot. I think that every, at least I'll say relative to the book, every chapter has its own kind of dynamic to it. And so I don't know if I can like ascribe a kind of singular ratio to like, this amount of memory versus this amount of cerebral stuff. The thing I read today is way more reflection and thinking, as opposed to a lot of my other stuff is really heavy and scene. And so I guess I think about it more about the momentum and how am I creating momentum on the page? And so if I'm not creating momentum using scene, then I have to be creating momentum using something else, whether it's photographs or whether it's, kind of like a quick allusion to a memory, or I think Paco mentioned like letting something like bubble out of the landscape. Those are like those like kind of momentous moments so I think about it more in terms of pacing than maybe than balance.
Also, I think like when you're thinking about the balance, you always have to remember as the writer that like you, the narrator, are a character, and so like you like if you're balancing memories in scene, that flow from the narrator versus more cerebral parts that are anchored in like history or something like that. You have to think about how the narrator has been constructed on the page. Like, is the reader ready to? They know the narrator well enough to like care about a long story about or do they have the facts to like anchor into the narrator's story at this moment? And so I think a lot of times that helps. Like, I don't know, it helps me figure out balance questions like that sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that it's probably specific to a particular project. And it's also, I think it's intuitive to each individual writer. So James, if you're a writer and you're working on a piece and you're trying to balance those two different elements, I would say that it might be different for the next piece you work on, or it might feel like each different piece or each whatever or project or whatever might feel different, or there might be a different strategy to whatever type of balance. And maybe you don't need balance at all. Maybe you just lean into like one thing. And then I think of it as like weaving, or like, bringing in multiple different strands. And I don't know if people can map stuff out and like really like chart too, but I don't work that way. In any case, I don't want to be prescriptive at all. And I'm just, this has been one of the best conversations and readings. And I'm so grateful to have both of you together. And I loved hearing both of your projects, and looking forward to seeing them in the larger world out for everyone to enjoy and to read and appreciate. We're out of time. Thank you so much, Emilio. Thank you, Francisco. It's been a pleasure. Francisco, thank you so much. Emilio, thank you. I hope everyone has a great evening. Enjoy, stay safe, be well, and keep writing if you're a writer, or keep making in whatever way you're feel the urge to create. So thank you.
Thanks for bringing us together.
Oh yeah, it's totally been my pleasure.